Hi everyone, welcome back to KG Graves. We're at Mount Vernon Estate in Virginia, USA, and we're here today to visit the grave of the first US President, George Washington. I hope you enjoy the video.
George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732 in Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, USA, to parents Augustine and Mary née Ball. He was a founding father and the first President of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. George was the first of 6 children. His siblings were Elizabeth, born 1733, Samuel, born 1734, John, born 1736, Charles, born 1738, and Mildred, born 1739. He also had 4 half-siblings from his father's first marriage to Jane Butler. These were Butler, born and died in 1716, Lawrence, born 1718, Augustine, born 1720, and Jane, born 1722. Among his siblings, he was particularly close to his older half-brother, Lawrence. The family moved to a plantation on Little Hunting Creek in 1735 before settling at Ferry Farm near Frankensburg, Virginia in 1738. When Augustine died in 1743, George inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. Because of his father's death, he did not have the formal education his elder half-brothers had received at Appleby Grammar School in England. He instead attended the Lower Church School in Hartfield. He learned mathematics and land surveying, and became a talented draftsman and mapmaker. George often visited Belvoir, the plantation of William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law, and Mount Vernon. Fairfax became George's patron and surrogate father. In 1748 he spent a month with a team surveying Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. The following year he received a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary. Even though George had not served a customary apprenticeship, Thomas Fairfax, William's cousin, appointed him surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia. George took his oath of office on the 20th of July 1749 and resigned in 1750. By 1752 he had bought almost 1,500 acres in the Shenandoah Valley and owned 2,315 acres. In 1751 George left mainland North America for the first and only time, when he accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. George contracted smallpox during the trip, which left his face slightly scarred and provided immunity against future infection. Lawrence died in 1752, and George leased Mount Vernon from his widow, Anne. He inherited it outright after her death in 1761. The Barbados journey exposed George to the wider British Atlantic world and to aspects of plantation society and imperial administration beyond Virginia. Lawrence Washington's service as Adjutant General of the Virginia Militia inspired George to seek a militia commission. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed George as a major and commander of one of the 4 militia districts. In February 1754, Dinwiddie promoted George to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 300-strong Virginia Regiment, with orders to confront the French at the forks of the Ohio. He set out with half the regiment in April and was soon aware that a French force of 1,000 had begun construction of Fort Duquesne there. In May, having established a defensive position at Great Meadows, George learned that the French had made camp 7 miles away. He decided to take the offensive. The French detachment proved to be only about 50 men, so on the 28th of May, George commanded an ambush. His small force of Virginians and Indian allies killed the French, including their commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who had been carrying a diplomatic message for the British. The French later found their countrymen dead and scalped, blaming George, who had retreated to Fort Necessity. The rest of the Virginia Regiment joined him the following month with news that he had been promoted to the rank of colonel and given the command of the full regiment. They were reinforced by an independent company of 100 South Carolinians, led by Captain James Mackay. His royal commission outranked George's, and a conflict of command ensued. On the 3rd of July, 900 French soldiers attacked Fort Necessity, and the ensuing battle ended in George's surrender. He did not speak French, but signed a surrender document in which he unwittingly took responsibility for assassinating Jumonville, later blaming the translator for not properly translating it. The Virginia Regiment was divided, and George was offered a captaincy in one of the newly formed regiments. He refused, as it would have been a demotion, and instead resigned his commission. The Jumonville affair became an incident which ignited the French and Indian War. The Virginia Regiment was reconstituted in August 1755, and Dinwiddie appointed George its commander, again with the rank of colonel. George clashed over seniority almost immediately, this time with Captain John Dagworthy, who commanded a detachment of Marylanders at the regiment's headquarters in Fort Cumberland. In 1758, the Virginia Regiment was assigned to the British Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. General John Forbes took George's advice on some aspects of the expedition, but rejected his opinion on the best route to the fort. Forbes nevertheless made George a brevet brigadier general and gave him command of one of the 3 brigades that was assigned to assault the fort. The French had abandoned the fort and the valley before the assault, however, and George only saw a friendly fire incident which left 14 dead and 26 injured. Frustrated, he resigned his commission soon afterwards and returned to Mount Vernon. Under George, the Virginian Regiment had defended 300 miles of frontier against 20 Indian attacks in 10 months. He increased the professionalism of the regiment, and it grew from 300 to 1,000 men. Though he failed to realise a royal commission, which made him hostile towards the British, he gained self-confidence, leadership skills, and knowledge of the British military tactics. The destructive competition he witnessed among colonial politicians fostered his later support of a strong central government. On the 6th of January 1759, George, at age 26, married Martha Dandridge Custis, the 27-year-old widow of wealthy plantation owner Daniel Park Custis. Martha was intelligent, gracious, and experienced in managing a planter's estate, and the couple had a happy marriage. They lived at Mount Vernon, where George cultivated tobacco and wheat. The marriage gave him control over Martha's 1/3 dower interest in the 18,000-acre Custis estate, and he managed the remaining 2/3 for Martha's children. As a result, he became one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, which increased his social standing. He also doubled the size of Mount Vernon to 6,500 acres, and by 1775 had more than doubled its slave population to over 100. As a respected military hero and large landowner, George held local offices and was elected to the Virginia Provincial Legislative, representing Frederick County for 7 years, beginning in 1758. Early in his legislative career, George was more politically active, starting in the 1760s, becoming a prominent critic of Britain's taxation and mercantilist policies towards the American colonies. He imported luxury goods from England, paying for them by exporting tobacco. His spending, combined with low tobacco prices, left him £1,800 in debt by 1764. George's complete reliance on London tobacco buyer and merchant Robert Carey also threatened his economic security. Between 1764 and 1766, he sought to diversify his holdings. He changed Mount Vernon's primary cash crop from tobacco to wheat and expanded operations to include flour milling and hemp farming. His stepdaughter Patsy suffered from epileptic attacks, and she died at Mount Vernon in 1773, allowing George to use part of the inheritance from her estate to settle his debts. The American Revolutionary War broke out on the 19th of April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. George hastily departed Mount Vernon on the 4th of May to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. On the 14th of June, Congress created the Continental Army, and John Adams nominated George as its commander-in-chief, mainly because of his military experience and the belief that a Virginian would better unite the colonies. He was unanimously elected by Congress the next day. George gave an acceptance speech on the 15th of June, declining a salary, though he was later reimbursed expenses. George initially banned the enlistment of black soldiers, both free and enslaved. The British saw an opportunity to divide the colonies. The colonial governor of Virginia issued a proclamation promising freedom to slaves if they joined the British forces. In response to this proclamation and the need for troops, George soon overturned his ban. By the end of the war, around 1/10 of the soldiers in the Continental Army were black, with some obtaining freedom. In April 1775, in response to the growing rebellious movement, British troops occupied Boston, led by General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in America. Local militia surrounded the city and trapped the British troops, resulting in a standoff. As George headed for Boston, he was greeted by cheering crowds and political ceremony. He became a symbol of the patriot cause. Upon his arrival on the 2nd of July, he went to inspect the army but found undisciplined militia. After consultation, he initiated Benjamin Franklin's suggested reforms, instituting military drills and imposing strict disciplinary measures. In October, King George III declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and relieved Gage of command, replacing him with General William Howe. When the Charles River froze over, George was eager to cross and storm Boston, but Horatio Gates and others were opposed to having untrained militia attempt to assault well-garrisoned fortifications. Instead, he agreed to secure the Dorchester Heights, above Boston, to try to force the British out. On the 17th of March, 8,906 British troops, 1,100 loyalists, and 1,220 women and children began a chaotic naval evacuation. George entered the city with 500 men. giving them explicit orders not to plunder. He refrained from exerting military authority in Boston, leaving civilian matters in the hands of local authorities. After the victory at Boston, George correctly guessed that the British would return to New York City and retaliate. He arrived there on the 13th of April 1776 and ordered the construction of fortifications. He also ordered his forces to treat civilians and their property with respect, to avoid the abuses Bostonians suffered at the hands of British troops. The British forces included more than 100 ships and thousands of troops, began arriving at Staten Island in July to lay siege to the city. Howe's troop totaled 32,000 regulars and auxiliaries. George had 23,000 men, mostly untrained recruits and militia. In August, Howe landed 20,000 troops at Gravesend, Brooklyn, and approached George's fortifications. Overruling his generals, he chose to fight, based on inaccurate information that Howe's army had only around 8,000 soldiers. In the Battle of Long Island, Howe assaulted George's flank and inflicted 1,500 Patriot casualties. George retreated to Manhattan. Howe sent a message to George to negotiate peace, addressing him as George Washington, Esquire. George declined to accept the message, demanding to be addressed with diplomatic protocol, not as a rebel. Despite misgivings, he heeded the advice of General Greene to defend Fort Washington, but was ultimately forced to abandon it. Howe pursued, and George retreated across the Hudson River to Fort Lee. In November, Howe captured Fort Washington. Loyalists in New York City considered Howe a liberator and spread a rumor that George had set fire to the city. Now reduced to 5,400 troops, George's army retreated through New Jersey. George crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where General John Sullivan joined him with 2,000 more troops. The future of the Continental Army was in doubt due to a lack of supplies, a harsh winter, expiring enlistments, and desertions. Howe posted a garrison at Trenton to hold western New Jersey and the east shore of the Delaware. At sunrise on the 26th of December 1776, George, aided by Colonel Knox and artillery, led his men in a successful surprise attack. George returned to New Jersey on the 3rd of January 1777, launching an attack on the British regulars at Princeton, with 40 Americans killed or wounded and 273 British killed or captured. Howe retreated to New York City for the winter. George took up winter headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey. Strategically, his victories at Trenton and Princeton were pivotal. They revived Patriot morale and quashed the British strategy of showing overwhelming force, followed by offering generous terms, changing the course of the war. Many more battles took place with the British from July 1777, including the Battle of Brandywine on the 11th of September in Philadelphia. George became America's first spy master by designing an espionage system against the British. On the 19th of August 1781, George began a march to Yorktown, Virginia, known now as the Celebrated March. He was in command of an army of 7,800 Frenchmen, 3,100 militia, and 8,000 Continental troops. By late September, Patriot French forces surrounded Yorktown, trapping the British army, while the French Navy emerged victorious at the Battle of Chesapeake. The final American offensive began with a shot fired by George. The siege ended with a British surrender on the 19th of October 1781. Over 7,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war. George negotiated the terms of surrender for 2 days, and the official signing ceremony took place. Although the peace treaty was not negotiated for 2 more years, Yorktown proved to be the last significant battle of the Revolutionary War, with the British Parliament agreeing to cease hostilities in March 1782. When peace negotiations began in April 1782, both the British and French began gradually evacuating their forces. George submitted an account of $450,000 in expenses, which he had advanced to the army. The account was settled, though it was vague about large sums and included expenses his wife had incurred through visits to his headquarters. When the Treaty of Paris was signed on the 3rd of September 1783, Britain officially recognised American independence. George disbanded his army, giving a farewell address to his soldiers on the 2nd of November. He oversaw the evacuation of British forces in New York and was greeted by parades and celebrations. In early December 1783, George bade farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern and resigned as Commander-in-Chief soon after. In a final appearance in uniform, he gave a statement to the Congress. He said, "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have superintendence of them, to His holy keeping." George's resignation was acclaimed at home and abroad. After spending just 10 days at Mount Vernon out of 8.5 years of war, George was eager to return home. He arrived on Christmas Eve. He oversaw the completion of remodelling work at Mount Vernon, which transformed his residence into the mansion that survives to this day, although his financial situation was not strong. Creditors paid him in depreciated wartime currency, and he owed significant amounts in taxes and wages. Mount Vernon had no profit during his absence, and he saw persistently poor crop yields due to pestilence and bad weather. His estate recorded its 11th year running at a deficit in 1787. To make his estate profitable again, he undertook a new landscaping plan and succeeded in cultivating a range of fast-growing trees and native shrubs. He also began breeding mules after being gifted a stud by King Charles III of Spain in 1785. He believed that they would revolutionize agriculture. Just prior to the first presidential election of 1789, in 1788, George was appointed Chancellor of the College of William and Mary. He continued to serve through his presidency until his death. The delegates to the convention for the first presidential election anticipated a George Washington presidency and left it to him to define the office once elected. When the state electors voted on the 4th of February 1789, George was unanimously elected, unique among US presidents. John Adams was elected vice president. Despite writing that he felt anxious and painful sensations about leaving Mount Vernon, George departed for New York City on the 16th of April. George was inaugurated on the 30th of April 1789, taking the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City. His coach was led by militia and a marching band and followed by statesmen and foreign dignitaries in an inaugural parade with a crowd of 10,000. Robert R. Livingston administered the oath using a Bible provided by the Masons. He read a speech in the Senate chamber asking that Almighty Being consecrate the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. Though he wished to serve without a salary, Congress insisted that he receive one, providing him $25,000 annually, compared to $5,000 annually for the Vice President. He also selected the first justices for the Supreme Court. Congress created executive departments in 1789, including the State Department, the War Department, and the Treasury Department. Domestic issues during George's first term included the planning of a permanent capital, the passage of several constitutional amendments, including the Bill of Rights, and continuing debates concerning slavery and expansion into Native American territory. George proclaimed on the 26th of November 1789 as a day of thanksgiving to encourage national unity. George initially planned to retire after his first term, weary of office and in poor health. After dealing with the infighting in his cabinet and with the partisan critics, he showed little enthusiasm for a second term, and Martha wanted him not to run. His nephew, George Augustine Washington, managing Mount Vernon in his absence, was critically ill, further increasing his desire to retire. Many, however, urged him to run for a second term. Madison told him that his absence would allow the dangerous political rift in his cabinet and the House to worsen. With the election of 1792 nearing, George agreed to run. On the 13th of February 1793, the Electoral College unanimously re-elected George Washington president, while John Adams was re-elected as vice president by a vote of 77 to 50. He was sworn into office by Associate Justice William Cushing on the 4th of March 1793 in Congress Hall in Philadelphia. Following the British abandonment of their forts around the Great Lakes, the proposed position of the Canada-United States border was sent to arbitration. Numerous pre-revolution debts were settled, and the British opened the British West Indies to American merchants. The agreement secured peace with Britain and a decade of prosperous trade. However, Jefferson claimed that it angered France and invited rather than avoided war. Jefferson's claim was verified when relations with France deteriorated after the signing of the treaty, with the French Directorate authorizing the seizure of American ships 2 days before George's term ended. Succeeding President John Adams was left with the prospect of war. In the final months of his presidency, George was assailed by his political foes and a partisan press who accused him of being ambitious and greedy. He came to regard the press as a disuniting force. At the end of his second term, George retired. He was dismayed with the personal attacks against him and wanted to ensure that a truly contested presidential election could be held. He did not feel bound to a 2-term limit, but his retirement set a significant precedent. He counselled friendship and commerce with all nations, but advised against involvement in European wars. He stressed the importance of religion, asserting that religion and morality are indispensable supports in a republic. When George retired to Mount Vernon in March 1797, he devoted time to his business interests, even though his plantation operations were only minimally profitable. Nearly all of his wealth was in the form of land and slaves rather than ready cash. To supplement his income, he erected a distillery for whiskey production using his enslaved workers. He was a land speculator, buying parcels of land to spur development around the nearby new capital of Washington, D.C., named in his honor in 1791, just up the Potomac River from Mount Vernon. He sold individual lots in the capital to middle-income investors rather than multiple lots of large investors, believing the former would be more likely to commit to making improvements. He held lands in the West which yielded little income, and he unsuccessfully attempted to sell them. At the time of his death in 1799, he held title to more than 58,000 acres of land across Virginia, Ohio, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Kentucky, and the Northwest Territory. In retirement, George became an even more committed Federalist. He vocally supported the Alien and Sedition Acts. When French privateers began seizing American ships in 1798, and deteriorating relations led to the Quasi-War, George wrote to Secretary of War James McHenry, offering to organise President Adams's army. Adams nominated him for a Lieutenant General commission and the position of Commander-in-Chief of the armies on the 4th of July 1798. George served as the commanding general from the 13th of July 1798 until his death 17 months later. On the 12th of December 1799, George inspected his farms on horseback in inclement weather for 5 hours. He then dined with guests without putting on dry clothes. He had a sore throat the next day, but was well enough to mark trees for cutting. Early the following morning, he awoke to an inflamed throat and difficulty breathing. He ordered his estate's overseer, George Rawlins, to remove nearly a pint of his blood. Bloodletting was common practice at the time. His family summoned doctors James Craik, Gustavus Richard Brown, and Elisha C. Dick. Brown initially believed George had quinsy. Dick thought the condition was more serious, violent inflammation of the membranes of the throat. They continued bloodletting to approximately 5 pints, but George's condition deteriorated further. Dick proposed a tracheotomy. The other physicians were not familiar with this procedure and disapproved. George instructed Brown and Dick to leave the room, while he assured Craik, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." On his deathbed, afraid of being entombed alive, George instructed his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to wait 3 days before his burial. According to Lear, George died between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on the 14th of December 1799, with Martha seated at the foot of his bed. His last words were, "'Tis well." The diagnosis of his illness and the immediate cause of his death have been subjects of debate. The published account of Craik and Brown stated that his symptoms were consistent with cyanosis trachealis, a term used to describe severe inflammation of the upper windpipe, including quinsy. Accusations of medical malpractice have persisted since George's death. Modern medical authors have largely concluded that he likely died from severe epiglottis complicated by the treatments he was given, which included multiple doses of calomel, a purgative like containing mercury, and extensive bloodletting, likely resulting in hypovolemic shock. George's funeral was held on the 18th of December 1799, 4 days after his death, at Mount Vernon. Cavalry and foot soldiers led the procession, and 6 colonels served as pallbearers. The Mount Vernon funeral service was restricted mostly to family and friends. Reverend Thomas Davis read a brief funeral service, followed by a ceremony performed by members of George's Masonic Lodge. He had been a Freemason since 1752. Word of his death travelled slowly, but as it reached other regions, church bells rang and many businesses closed. Memorial processions were held in major cities of the United States. Martha burned her correspondence with George to protect its privacy, though 5 letters between the couple are known to have survived. George was buried in the Washington family vault at Mount Vernon on the 18th of December 1799. In his will, he left instructions for the construction of a new vault. This was completed in 1831 after a disgruntled ex-employee of the estate attempted to steal what he thought was George's school. In 1832, a joint congressional committee debated moving his body from Mount Vernon to a crypt in the United States Capitol. Southern opposition was intense, antagonized by the ever-growing rift between North and South. Many were concerned where his remains could end up. George's remains stayed in Mount Vernon. On the 7th of October 1837, his remains, still in the original lead coffin, were placed within a marble sarcophagus designed by William Strickland and constructed by John Struthers. During George's lifetime, at least 577 slaves lived and worked at Mount Vernon. He inherited some, gained control of 84 dower slaves upon his marriage to Martha, and purchased at least 71 slaves between 1752 and 1773. From 1786 he rented slaves as part of an agreement regarding a neighbouring estate that totalled 40 in 1799. Slavery was deeply ingrained in the economic and social fabric of the colony of Virginia. Prior to the Revolutionary War, his views on slavery matched those of most Virginia planters of the time. His principal interest was still their contribution to the economic life of the plantation. Beginning in the 1760s, however, he gradually grew to oppose it. His first doubts were prompted by his choice to transition from tobacco to grain crops, which left him with a costly surplus of slaves, causing him to question the system's economic efficiency. In a 1778 letter to Lund, Washington, he made clear his desire to get quit of Negroes. As president, he remained publicly silent on the topic, believing it was a nationally divisive issue that could undermine the Union. In personal correspondence the next year, he made clear his desire to see the institution of slavery ended by a gradual legislative process, a view that correlated with the mainstream anti-slavery literature published in the 1780s. George emancipated 123 or 124 slaves, which was highly unusual among the large slave-holding Virginians during the Revolutionary era. However, he remained dependent on slave labour to work his farms. Based on his private papers and on accounts from his contemporaries, George slowly developed a cautious sympathy towards abolitionism that ended with his will freeing his long-term valet, Billy Lee, and freeing the rest of his personally owned slaves outright upon Martha's death. On the 1st of January 1801, 1 year after George Washington's death, Martha Washington signed an order to free his slaves. Many of them were reluctant to leave, others refused to abandon spouses or children, still held as dower slaves by the Custis estate. Following George's instructions in his will, funds were used to feed and clothe the young, aged and infirm slaves until the early 1830s. George's 1751 bout with smallpox may have rendered him sterile, though biographer Ron Chernow notes that it is possible Martha sustained injury during the birth of Patsy, her final child, making additional births impossible. The couple lamented not having children together. He suffered from severe tooth decay and ultimately lost all of his teeth except one. He had several sets of false teeth during his presidency. Contrary to common law, these were not made of wood, but of metal, ivory, bone, animal teeth, and human teeth possibly obtained from slaves. His dental problems left him in constant pain, which he treated with laudanum, a form of opium. He also experienced a painful growth in his thigh early in his first presidential term, followed by a life-threatening bout of pneumonia in 1790, from which he never fully recovered. George was a talented equestrian. Jefferson described him as the best horseman of his age. He collected thoroughbreds at Mount Vernon. His two favourite horses were Blueskin and Nelson. George Washington is one of the most influential figures in American history. Virginia's governor, Henry Lee III, eulogized him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Polls have consistently placed him among the highest ranked of presidents. President Gerald Ford stated that Washington would rank first among all officers of the army, past and present. Along with other founding fathers, George has been criticized for holding enslaved people. Though he expressed the desire to see the abolition of slavery through legislation, he did not initiate or support any initiatives for bringing about its end. This has led to calls to remove his name from public buildings and his statue from public spaces. Many places and monuments have been named in honor of George, including the capital city of Washington, D.C. and the state of Washington. On the 21st of February 1885, the Washington Monument was dedicated, a 555-foot marble obelisk on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. He also appears as one of the 4 presidents on the Shrine of Democracy, a colossal sculpture by Gutzon Borglum on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. The George Washington Bridge opened in 1931 and connects New York City to New Jersey. He appears in contemporary United States currency, including the $1 bill, a presidential $1 coin, and the $quarter coin, the Washington Quarter. George was pictured on the nation's first postage stamp in 1847 and has since appeared on more United States stamps than anyone else. Let's see where his grave is located.
So there you have it, the grave of the first US President, George Washington. As usual, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.
Rest in peace, George Washington.